I guess, with him and his wife, perhaps, or other women?
I didn't see him a lot with I remember him with Althea in the old days, but I didn't see him a lot with Helen. I saw him once in a while, and I didn't get the impression this was a particularly happy marriage. I mean, she became his nurse and his agent and his guardian because he was so incapacitated. But I mean, man was in hell. He really was late in his life. There's no doubt. If you think about it, it was just terrible. And he was blind, and things had not gone well for him. He didn't have any peace of mind, and I think he was half crazy. A terrible situation, and a writer whose time had gone by. Harsh stuff, difficult to deal with. I remember once a terrible. And it sounds funny, but it's a strange thing. I saw him coming up the hall once at the New Yorker, and he was being led up the hall by somebody. He had to be led around, and a young woman named Elizabeth Cullinan, who was my assistant, who was incidentally became a wonderful writer on her own. A very shy, well-brought-up girl, and Catholic upbringing, and very polite. And I saw her going the other way, and as he came by, she flattened herself against the wall. And as Thurber went by, she went like that, stuck her tongue out at him. So nobody liked him. He was not a liked person. I mean, it's a great thing to see someone stick their tongue out at a blind man, but I mean, at the same time, you would hate to think of somebody doing this to you. It's like a dream scene, you know.
So does it surprise you that a man who was blind like that could produce so much work?
Yeah, it did. It did. And of course, this all went very contrary to the public view of Thurber, because I became known among my friends. I was editing Jim Thurber at the New Yorker, and they said, "Boy, that must be wonderful! Wow!" And if I said it's not so wonderful, and then occasionally would murmur that he wasn't a prince among men, they would say, "But he's blind," as if someone who is blind is automatically, a person of great spirit and courage and silence and forbearance and whatever the cliche of the wonderful blind person, which wasn't the case.
I remember Frank Modell once told me he only met Thurber a couple times, but he was in the fire stairs at the old New Yorker offices, and he was struggling to get down the stairs. So he thought, well, I should help this man. He's worth $1 million.
Yeah.
And he went to help him, and Thurber just threw him against the wall. Get out of my way! I can do this myself.
Yeah.
I said, I'll never touch him again.
Yeah. And I heard tales of his drunken fights, but I think Maeve Brennan is said to have punched him once. Maybe he punched Maeve and then she punched him or something, which is a scene we shouldn't think about for too long.
Can you talk a little bit about what distinguishes Thurber's style from, let's say, Benchley or Perlman or Liebling?
Well, Liebling wasn't a humorist, of course. Jim did have his reporter side as well. I mean, he did some reporting, and he was a tennis correspondent for the New Yorker. We had a tennis column. He would go to Forest Hills and write about tennis and some other straight things. Perlman was his own invention, came along a little bit later than Jim, and his own way of using the language was quite different from Thurber. The Benchley pieces, in my mind, were a sort of a kind of writing that we think of as nonsense, filled with non sequiturs and images of Benchley as a bumbler, as a foolish person, but a terribly funny writer, a great parodist, a really sensational parodist, and there's a lot of laughter still in the old little Benchley pieces. They were very short. Sometimes he's just a couple of pages. Thurber's stuff at its best, and I think there are two things that I remember particularly, were his Columbus stories, My Life in Hard Times, and those were sort of set pieces that he had been telling to people for years. And he writes in maybe I think at the beginning of The Night the Bed Fell, one of the famous stories, that this is better told than written. And he'd been telling it for years that it's better if you throw furniture around and make sounds of a dog barking. And these were a series of family misadventures. But as others have pointed out, Adam Gopnik points out that the thing about Thurber's style and all this was that it was a very workmanlike, modest, direct form of writing humor. And American humor, a lot of it up to that point had been sort of highfalutin and full of flourishes and writing that said, this is funny writing. And Thurber's was direct and very much of the moment. It felt like a new kind of American writing. It felt youthful. And of course he had some great ideas. I mean, I think that Walter Mitty's a great idea, and the story called The Catbird Seat about an unpleasant, dominating woman he had a whole number of those later casuals that in the 30s and late 30s and in the 40s that were funny ideas. I think that also, when you can't talk about him just as a writer, because his drawing, I think, in a way, I think that he deserves to be remembered more as an artist than as a writer. His drawings for the New Yorker were just terrific. There was nobody like him, and there's a whole bunch of them that still seem extremely funny to me. A lot of this stuff you go back, and I know this stuff very well from my youth. I know a lot of it in my head, but when I go back and look at it, the Thurber drawings still seem funny to me. And they're great lines, and that rough, almost non-drawing worked perfectly for what he was doing. And I think some of his extended little things, I mean, the dog in the hat is a wonderful strip. The dog that eats the hat, and the husband comes and pretends that he's eaten his wife's hat so that the dog won't be punished. And I think that the war between men and women is pretty good. It holds up pretty well, and some funny ideas of men and women battling each other as if it was in the Civil War. Very telling in its subject matter, but and that went on for quite a while. I think he would have had a happier life later on if he still could draw, but his eyesight went, and he finally ended up, using these huge magnifying glass to get the remains of his one eye to work, and he drew in bigger pieces of paper, but he really had to stop. And I think that was a big piece knocked off him.
I remember Tom Devens got him white chalk to write on a black background.
I heard that, yeah. I never saw that, yeah.
He tried it a little bit, but it didn't work.
Yeah.
Actually, E.B. White is considered very responsible for getting Thurber's drawings in print. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I never saw that, but I certainly heard it at the time that Andy White had kept taking these out of the wastepaper basket. Jim was drawing all the time, and taking them out of the wastepaper basket and handing them in, and that's when they first began to publish them. And of course, they had that very early collaboration on the book Is Sex Necessary? And Thurber illustrated those, which is, again, the stuff there he was on paper, and he suddenly become an artist. And I think it's, again, we go back to Harold Ross. I think it was enterprising for Ross it showed Ross's freedom to take these very untutored and imperfect drawings of Thurber's and to see what they were, which is very funny and very appropriate to the person who did them. They were a true expression of the man, and to put them right into the magazine and run them and ask for more. I was, the other side of Thurber we haven't mentioned is his children's books, and I was always in a little bit of doubt about those. I felt that they were children's books really written for adults. I don't know of any children who read Thurber's books now, but certainly Andy White's books are read everywhere. But I don't think that Jim quite had that touch. They were elegantly done, and the 13 Clocks and things like that. You think it had an appeal. It was interesting, but I think more interesting to have grown up than to children.
How about the fables?
Yeah, the fables are wonderful. I think I was just looking at those the other day. The fables do hold up, and those were done a little bit later. I think those were done in the 40s, late 40s, and those were all funny. And the drawings were fun, and the punchlines were great. And early to rise and early to bed makes the male healthy and wealthy and dead. And those old lines are They were funny.
Yeah, that's great. I guess we're doing very good. I just had a couple other questions. Did you ever experience this so-called photographic memory that he had? Did that ever?
Yeah, he used to trot this out, and he would remember birthdays, but he made some mistakes too. He'd gotten a couple of dates wrong. I can't remember what they were, but I don't think he was as photographic near the end as he had been earlier. And I think once he got Andy White's birthday wrong, he said, I think he said July 14th instead of July 11th or something like that. There were little slips. So if we boast about our perfect memory, we better be damn sure that it's still there.
And Mrs. White, do you remember her later in life talking about him?
Well, I think she was very fond of Jim, and I think at the time of her divorce and when she was getting ready to marry Andy White, which is a great emotional problem for her. I mean, she got a divorce and got remarried, which she didn't really approve of, but she did it. And I think that Thurber was a great support to her, and he was a great friend of Andy's, and to have somebody else there who it wasn't just the two of them. I mean, Jim was Andy White's sidekick, and I think this was, and he was cheerful. She was very fond of him. I think she was always grateful to him for that. But well, I think that I can't prove it, but I think that the fact that it was Sean after 1951, it was Sean was the editor and the person for whom he was working, and not Russ, was another part of the problem for him, because I think he probably came to respect Sean. But of course, Sean arrived after the best of his work and the best of his life was over with, so it was hard to get used to. And I think that he probably, I can't remember for sure, but I think he probably may have said demeaning things about this little man, or some things like this about Sean. Sean, for his part, of course, was just as admiring and receptive to Thurber. I mean, the great thing about Sean was that he was not just punctilious, but he was extremely sensitive about writers and contributors and who they were, and editors as well. And he would never have suggested to Thurber that his work was less than it was. If he said, if we had to turn something down, he was immensely regretful. He never was casual about saying something like that. And he felt great regret. This didn't solve the problem for Thurber, but I think it probably added to his frustration in a way. But one shouldn't assume that the New Yorker thought less about Thurber, because that wasn't the case.
And the cartoonists, did they have a relationship with him, or did they resent his fame based on his scribbles?
I don't know. I just don't know. I never talked with any of the artists about what they felt about Thurber. I don't think they resented him. I mean, I would be very surprised. I mean, because he was not a real artist. Right. Yeah. I don't think they felt that way. But, they were all competitive, of course, trying to get into the magazine, and he wasn't. In those days, was not drawing for us. It was over.
I was just wondering if Adams and Thurber ever had much contact.
I don't believe so, but I can't say.
That was pretty much the last question. Do you think of any contemporary humorists today that resemble Thurber in any way that come to mind?
No, I can't. I don't think there's anybody. I think he's very much part of his time. Certainly, and I can't think of anyone in the New Yorker bunch, the whole New Yorker phenomenon in the early to mid '30s has not been reproduced in journalism. And we talked earlier about what Americans think about humor, and there's always a feeling that we were funnier in the past. But we really were funnier then. There was a wonderful assemblage of people writing for the New Yorker, not just humorists, but journalists that was put together, and the atmosphere around the New Yorker, when it was getting better and better almost week by week. You can go through stretches in the 30s and into the 40s when you see the arrival of new writers and New Yorker doing new things and becoming better and better and more of what we came to think of it, what it was. I can't think of another publication that is anything like that. Certainly that was doing something serious, but also was that art and fiction and humor were very much a central part of the mix. It hasn't happened again since then, and it's something we should not look back on. I think not with sadness, but with gratitude, because it was allowed to happen. It was encouraged, and you have to give Ross the main credit for that. It was his atmosphere, not just his idea, but the kind of person he was that allowed this to happen.
It's almost like the Yankees in the 1940s.
Yeah, it was. I mean, I think that Thurber and White and Perelman and Liebling and all the other writers and artists and everybody that began to flourish in there, they could feel great pride in what they did, but they also were terrifically lucky because they had a place to have this happen.
And if Thurber were alive today, would there anything you'd want to talk to him about?
Well, I'd be afraid he'd yell at me, but no, that's unfair. I don't know. I can't. I don't have any leftover wish to have talked to him because he wasn't very good to me, and I mean, he wasn't civil, God knows, but I forgave him.
Yeah, it's a nice place to stop.
Good.
Thank you very much.
Okay, not at all.
We just have a couple of 30 seconds of what they call room tone.
Yeah, okay, fine.
And if you could tell a little bit how you first came into Thurber's life and how that started.
Well, I was an actress, unemployed at the time, and so I got a job as production secretary for Thurber Carnival. It was already on the road. I think it had already opened in Cincinnati, and I flew to Detroit in a snowstorm to the Cadillac Hotel, and there I met Thurber, Jim, and Helen and Burgess, and I became their secretary, production secretary, and general understudy to all the women. So it was quite an experience.
Do you remember the first time you saw him? Can you recall that moment when you first met him?
No, not specifically, because there was so much chaos. I mean, it was suddenly there was James Thurber, and then suddenly there was Burgess Meredith, and I was supposed to be doing a lot of things that I didn't quite know what was going on because it was in the middle of the tour. And I hadn't realized that he was totally blind by the time I knew him. And now, when I think back to knowing Thurber, I feel like I knew him for about 10 years. But as I told you, I only knew him for 2 years, 1960, and then he died in 61. So it was a very intense time. Being on the road is intense anyway. And so I don't remember the specific moment.
How would you describe him physically?
Tall, very tall, but then I'm short. And his hands were always something I loved to watch. He had very expressive hands. And I used to lead him around a lot in the theaters. He had a joke. He used to call me Luella because he said that in the dark world that he lived in, he said women were always coming up to him and saying, "Jim, do you remember me? It's Luella." And of course, he had no idea who they were. He certainly didn't remember them at all. So he called me Luella. And so I think of him as tall and dependent in the sense of having to hold on to someone walking around. Funny. He was a funny man. And he thought I was funny, but not because I intended to be. But in all the chaos of joining the tour, I sometimes got rattled, and I guess things came out that made him laugh. Because we spent a lot of time together doing rewrites. It was the kind of show you could rewrite forever because, as you know, it wasn't a regular play. It was made up of bits and pieces from all his works. So.
Can you describe a little bit how the process of him rewriting stuff, do you remember being privy to that?
Oh, yes. A lot of it was a question of he had so much material, and because the pieces were short, it was trying something in one place and then trying it in another place in the show and shortening it, usually so it would fit in. he loved to rewrite. He always had something new he wanted to try, another way of putting it. And later on, as you know, he went into the show and in New York, and he was in a sketch of his called File and Forget, and I was in it too. I was his real-life secretary, and then I was on stage with him. And he got very bored with his own lines. It was horrifying. And I'd come on stage, and he'd just say what he wanted to say. And so it was an improv and rather terrifying. But I asked him why he did it, and he said he got tired of his lines. He wanted to try things. So
What was he like as an actor?
to me, he was James Thurber. He was exactly himself on stage. And, you know, he had a great, he adored words, where they came from. He wrote a wonderful book called In a Word. Their roots and derivations. He loved punctuation. I mean, he loved it almost like a physical act, the writing. And so he would try things, changing words around and so on. But you have to remember this was a long time ago, 1960.
Do you remember him liking the applause and so forth,
Yes.
being in the crowd in the theater?
Yes, you know, I think those 2 years that I knew him, I saw him at his happiest. He loved performing in New York, but before that, when we were on the road and rewrites, he was the center of attention. He was in the limelight. He loved hearing the laughter and the applause, and he loved the attention. And that just was raised to a higher degree when he went on stage, because then it was both, on stage and off. He loved it. And then, when the show was over, he went very quickly downhill. He was very depressed, very despondent. So I think in those 2 years that I knew him, I saw him at his happiest and at his unhappiest.
Can you tell a little bit, just for the viewers who won't know, a little bit about how the Thurber Carnival, what it was about, and how it manifested itself on stage?
Well,
Before we get that question, I'm rolling out, so I have to change tapes.
Okay, coming up is Wild Sound from Sound Roll number 5. It's going to be a room tone from the interview before, or the interview we just saw, and also some run-on between camera rolls.
And he was cheerful. She was very fond of him. I think she was always grateful to him for that. But when she moved up to Maine, and his increasing interest in fame, and his particularly the Ross book, she never forgave him for the Ross book, because she was intensely loyal to Harold Ross.
Now I just have the night. We just have a couple of 30 seconds of what they call room tone.
Yeah, okay, fine.
Okay, so everyone's still for about 15 seconds. And room tone. This is going to do. Let's try again. And this is room tone, take 2. Thank you.
Okay.
Also have a book.
That's it.